Okay, welcome everyone. And this is an exciting event, poetry reading, where we have two awesome poets with us today. We're just so very lucky, all because of a happy accident. Who happened to use the same cover photo in their newly coming up poetry books. And this kind of created a whole new conversation on faith, ancestry, belonging, and the conversation with the divine, and especially in Jessica's, poetry. So I will briefly introduce them, and then they will do their poetry readings, and we will have some time for a discussion at the end and Q&A. So this event is being sponsored by the English Department, the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Program, and the TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding. I am the program manager of the TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding. My name is Samiha. So we have here Jessica Jacobs with us, and she is most recently the author of On Alone, which came up from 4-Way Books just in March. It's a very new release. But she also has, other books from 4-Way Books from 2019, Take Me With You Wherever You're Going, which was one of Library Journal's best poetry books of the year and winner of the Devil's Kitchen and Goldie Awards, and many other books. She is also the founder and executive director of Yetzirah, a hearth for Jewish poetry. And I will now leave the stage to Jessica, and she is going to be doing her poetry reading too.
Thanks, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Phil, for inviting me. It's just such an honor to be able to be here. I'm looking forward to hearing your poems. This is the first time I've read from this book, and I was afraid I was actually reading from Phil's book. But this is, okay, I think that's okay. Great. So this is a collection of poems in conversation with the book of Genesis. Can you hear me in the back? Are we, okay. And so, as I was telling some students earlier, I came from a very secular Jewish home. And when I was probably about 12 or 13, I just decided religion's not really for me. And for a number of reasons, which we might discuss a little later, in my 30s, I found myself with really big questions about what it meant to be a good person, what it meant to live a worthwhile life. And I found myself all of a sudden turning to sacred text and reading the Torah and what you all generally call the Hebrew Bible. And what you would call the Old Testament, I would call it the Hebrew Bible. But what I was shocked by was how everything I read seemed to speak to my life and seemed to speak to the world around me. And to really engage with these texts and to truly understand them, I began to write poems in conversation with the book of Genesis. So that's what I'm going to read to you today. And one of the great mysteries to me as someone who kind of came back to religion later in life was the idea of prayer. And so this is kind of one of my early explorations of prayer. Prayer should be a tunnel, my Hebrew teacher says. And I find myself pigtailed, a kid again, descending from a blazing Florida day into the murky depths of SeaWorld's tunnel of terror, a massive glass passage through a seawater tank. Sharks glide by, fins boxed and furrowed as the edges of old treasure maps. Far above, the inaccessible surface ripples a chainmail of light. Prayer should be a tunnel, she says again, making an O of her hands and pushing it out before her. My teacher, also a dancer, uses her body to create structures in the air. It should take you there, she says. English is not her first language, but by there, I know she means God. By tunnel, I think she means conduit, a direct channel in, divine umbilical. A sign in line showed a whale teetering atop one of the tunnel's glass blocks to demonstrate its fortitude, to tell me not to be afraid. But I am. Each shark with its hacksaw teeth clearly meant for me. And it's only a matter of time before one gnaws its way through, bringing all the water rushing in. And what would happen first? Drowning or being devoured? For those like me, rooted in terror, a moving sidewalk keeps us in motion, easing us through the eerie underpass, acting just like time, which moves us without the need for us to move, which moves us whether or not we want it to. Prayer should be a tunnel, she says, but what words, what melody would let me make with my body such grand architecture in the air? Let me stand in one place and travel both out and in. Let me sink and not drown. Let me wander unafraid into the open mouth and emerge unscathed and changed. So the other thing that really surprised me was how it seemed like so many of the stories that I was reading about had their echoes in today. And so for me, it was impossible to read about the flood and Noah's Ark and not think about the climate crisis, and not think about the fact that so many of the nations that are suffering the most, islands that are almost underwater, are the people who least contributed to the climate crisis and are also the people who are least able to deal with it because they don't have the means. And there's an interesting teaching about Noah, which is, if you read the text closely, it's not just that he was righteous, he was the most righteous of his generation, which was a generation that deserved to be drowned. So it's all relative. But so there's a teaching that he was a tzaddik in pelt. So like just a tzaddik, a true righteous person, let's say everybody else is cold, they build a fire. A tzaddik in pelts is a righteous person in furs. So maybe they're going to build a fire for everybody else, but first they're going to put on a fur coat so they're warm. And I think that's an interesting way to think about how we as a nation are dealing with climate change. So there's a headline from Reuters, from the United Nations Human Rights Council on climate change and poverty. In climate apartheid, rich will save themselves while poor suffer. And the other thing you need to know is that the Hebrew word teva, which is normally translated as ark, can also mean word. Collective nouns. When Noah was still just a man, not yet sailor and savior, God said, "Make yourself a word, for I have decided to silence all flesh." Scraping muscle from a hide, his wife crouched nearby, listening. Without argument or question, without a single signal of warning to neighbors or friends, her husband, that little wind-up toy, God's docile errand boy, complied. He built the word to spec, big enough to hold two of every creature, but too small for her mother, too small for her brother, no matter how she wept. From planks of gopher wood smeared with pitch, Noah built the word, and God shut them up in it. Water crushed down from the sky, fountain from the seas, dissolving living dust and breath to reefs of hushed mud. And Noah, a silent man in a silenced world, drifting in a wooden word. With an otter placid as a stole across his shoulders, instead of talking, he lived in his hands, picking nits, troughing food and water, always more water, tending to every walking, creeping, winged thing, to all beings but her, never lying beside her, never tasting the taste of sleep. His tongue withered to a husk. The dark hold was mobbed with chitter, roar, and screech without restraint, and from outside the ceaseless babble of wood and rain. She was drowning in languages she couldn't speak, and he never offered her a word of comfort. When the rains finally ended, Noah bound a rope to the rafters. Before the raven, before the doves, he lowered himself from the word's one window. A splash, and he leashed the rope to his ankle. A splash, and he leashed the rope to his ankle, leaned back, and let his hands fall empty. Let the flood embrace him. Grime sloughed from him into the waves until the only animal he smelled was himself. Noah bobbed there, a beaming buoy, tethered to the word in which the future floated, where his wife, unseen, the new Eve, humanity's unnamed mother, looked out from the window and watched as he gave himself to the killing waters, looked past him, trying not to think of the death and rot that robbed him. Is a man good, she wondered, who can construct a word large enough for only a chosen few? And now, no matter what promise once rainbowed the sky, before the world is again silent, the water and weather already rising, already tearing the roofs from the poorest among us, instead of floating, unnoticing, past those taken by the tides, can't we build a peaceful fleet, lashed by syntax and spring lines into a sentence of survival? Words that welcome not just some, but all. It's the joy of giving readings in person. You don't get snaps on campus. All right. But the text also helped me look at things a little more personal. I know it's freezing out, but I just came from New York. It was officially spring there, so I think it's coming. I know. There are tulip magnolias and daffodils. It's glorious. So I feel like reading a love poem was a good thing. It's a little strange for me to read a love poem about a marriage that is no longer. But as I've been thinking about this, what I've realized is that just because love doesn't last always, doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile. So, this poem opens with a quote from Jean Valentine. Blessed are they who remember that what they now have, they once longed for. At first sight, many seeings later. And this poem opens with a joke. It's okay to laugh at poetry readings or something like that. We're going to get real dark after this. So, at first sight, many seeings later. Lifting my chin, my wife said, "When you look at my breast like that, you make my face feel lonely." So this was new marriage on a Wednesday morning. When Rebecca saw Isaac the first time, he was striding the noon field. A man at full sunlight, he cast no shadow. From her camel, most translators spin nafal into alighted, allowing her some dignity. The truth is, it means she fell. In a cloud of desert dust, Rebecca was a smitten, resplendent heap, lanterning up at her future mate. The truth is, in the beginning, her face was too much for me. The force of my desire matched. Now, years on, we have matching slippers, and each night on the couch between us, the dog snores. How little we look at what we think we know, less seeing than simply noting, yes, still there. Yet if the past of love is longing, the future grief, at least for one of us, let the present praise the little brown bird of the familiar. This swift, flown into the sweet sheet of her skin, wings in upstroke, the apexed angles of her collarbone. Let me fall for my camel again and again. Let me gaze up and see her new. Spring is coming, it's true, I promise. One of the things that I really struggled with the most, but then I ultimately found the most helpful, and maybe you'll find this in your own writing or studies, is that the Torah is thought of as a sacred text, whatever you think of like where it came from, who wrote it. But there's an idea that every single word, every jot and tittle, right, is sacred. And so if there's something, even if it seems like a mistake, but if there's something that's hard or you don't understand, it's not like with literature where you can just be like, well, that's a bad book, right? It's that you need to spend enough time with it that you can eventually learn from it. And especially in Genesis, which has so many dark stories, it made me look at really some of the darkest parts of other people, but also of myself. And one of those stories for me that I just still can't totally wrap my mind around is the binding of Isaac. When Abraham is ordered to take his son up and to sacrifice him as a way of showing his faith. And I think especially in a time when there's so many demands to make, absolute statements and take sides, especially on issues that don't have sides or have 1,000 sides. I just wonder what might happen if we approach things with more curiosity and compassion. And that's kind of what this poem is trying to figure out. There's a quote from the philosopher Eric Hoffer: "Absolute faith corrupts as absolutely as absolute power." And I think this is the poem that you have in front of you. Which one? No, other one? Okay, all right, you do have it in front of you. All right, fabulous. Hi, welcome. All right, why there is no Hebrew word for obey. What came later was the real trial, because God knew Isaac would not die, while Abraham climbed the mountain believing he would. With conviction tempered in the fires of his faith, he walked up through the shaded valley, his son resolute ahead on the trail. Behind them, Sarah, Isaac's mother, Abraham's wife, a small darkness in the distance, growing forever smaller. He bound his beloved son, pulled back his legs, wrenched back his arms, knotted his ankles to his wrists, and laid him on that altar like a child falling through the sky. He held the knife, knowing from every animal he'd ever sacrificed how his son would jerk and shudder when the blade opened his throat. The familiar smoke of offered flesh. What came later, even with Isaac alive in the fields, inside Abraham was the knowledge of what he'd been willing to do. When they passed in the tent, Isaac rubbed a remembered ache in his shoulder and never again held his father's eye. Sarah, smelling the imagined ashes on her husband's fingers, the blood in the crease of his throat, turned from him in the night. And on every path Abraham walked from that day forward, his son as he had been, a small back, barely the span of his hand, slung with the kindling meant for his burning. Seconds from the slaughter of the one meant to carry his line, of the son he'd wanted all his life. Who's to say the voice in his head was God? Judaism is not a faith, but a tradition. And isn't doubt the crux of conscience? Yet what came later, on a Sabbath morning, centuries on, was a congregation in Pittsburgh reading this story of Isaac's binding of Abraham's terrible bind, when a man burning with unquestioning belief entered with a gun and, with no better angel to stay his hand, opened fire, believing the death of Jews would keep our country safe, believing this massacre, elderly congregants bleeding out on the floor, is God's work. Who would call such actions holy? And how many more times will each of us come down from the mountain, conviction knocking like a knife in our belt loop, stained with all we would have done? My daily gods are minor ones, of pride, of lust, of impatience and complacency. Yet how many have I harmed on the way to what I thought was right, or with hindsight, on the way to what I wanted? And how many sorry sacrifices have I made of myself? What if we turn from certainty and arm ourselves instead with questions? Obey, obey, obey is everywhere in translation. The real word is Shema. Listen. I'm just gonna read you one final poem and turn it over to Mr. Dr. Metris. So one of the things I'm very interested in is etymology and also mistranslations, which I just think is kind of fascinating. This poem's a little sad. I was told I should tell people that, because otherwise it fools them. But the title's really happy, so there you go. So we'll start high and good. Thank you all very much for listening and being here today. Mazel tov. That's the title. Mazel tov. Circular breather, my dog can whine without ceasing. His tail thumping the wall beside the bed to call me up and out to the yard instead. In moonlight, the hydrangea's white blossoms are a zodiac of branch-bound constellations. Once God called Abraham out from his tent to the open field to count the uncountable lights in the sky, promising offspring bountiful as dust, numerous as the stars. Like Abraham, I too left my land, my birthplace, my father's house. But the closest I have to offspring is lifting his leg at the azalea, nose busy with the news the night air brings. Mazel tov, we say at births and other joyous occasions, the Jewish go-to for congratulations. Yet tov means good, and mazel, constellation or destiny. And sometimes, like Abraham, you must leave the place that grew you to grow toward better stars. In the house, my love is sleeping. Along the fence top, a procession of possums reminds that even in darkness, there are those who can see. Above, trees thick with summer frame a porthole, the sky. Maybe, though, it's not always the stars that matter, but the space between them, the lines we draw to shape the absence, the lives we forge around what goes missing. So if I wish you mazel tov, know what I'll mean is, may you live beneath good stars and find a reason to open your door to the night. From the deck, the cool breeze makes a festival of the silver-lit leaves. Under my palm, the warmth of his fur, the rise of his ribs. He doesn't suspect his kidneys are failing, that his muzzle is white as the winter the vet has said he will not live to see. Like all of us, he is dying. Like most of us, he doesn't know it. his chin on my leg. He trusts me, the weight of his head. May the darkness be as much a blessing as the stars. Oh yes, please. I said
all the time. Thank you. Now we're gonna hear from Dr Metris. Most of you, probably all of you, already know him, but I'll still read his short bio for you. He's the author of 12 books, including his newest, Fugitive/Refuge, and then Sand Opera and Shrapnel Maps. Among his awards are a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, 2 NEA Fellowships. What's NEA?
National Endowment of the Arts.
National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship, and 3 Arab American Book Awards. And he is a professor of English here at John Carroll and the director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Program.
I'm going to do something I don't usually do in my classes, which is unmask. So some of you will see my lower half of my face. Are you all ready for this? It's always a horror, right? Did that happen to you during COVID that you saw people masked and then suddenly they were unmasked? You're like, wait, I thought you were different under there. So, okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Smiatopoulos and the TUI Center for Interreligious Understanding for moderating and co-hosting with us. And thank you so much, Jessica. We had this hilarious interchange in which she shared by email that when I shared my book cover release, which is the thing you do in poetry and probably nothing else, like, hey, I've got a book coming out. She said, I'm sorry to say, like a very long message about we have the same cover and the books are coming out around the same time. Is there a way we could change it? And I laughed. I thought it was hilarious. Because as a writer and as an artist, we like to believe that we are somehow unique, that our visions are, only our own, that only I could have chosen this cover, and in fact, my twin sister here, Jessica Jacobs, did. And so we just leaned into it as an opportunity, and Jessica shared with me that one of her friends said, just very concisely, or God, and we chose God. So we've had this wonderful conversation and friendship over the last number of months, and have sort of supported our books kind of coming out at the same time. So grateful to hear your work in person and for the work that you do on the page and elsewhere. So thanks. I thought it might be fun to do a poem that might be a little bit of a twin of Mazel Tov, which is a poem that requires audience participation. I usually save this for the end, but I figure this might be a nice time for it. It's called Raise Your Glass. So what I need you to do is to pretend that you have a glass in your right hand, which you will raise to make a series of toasts with me. So when I say a toast, I would like you to raise your imaginary glass and say a toast. And there will be a series of little poems that are dealing with the nature of this book, which is it's really an exploration of human migration, how many people have lost their homes, how many people have become refugees, and this search that we all have, even if we haven't had that particular experience, this longing for home, this longing not simply for a house, but to come home to ourselves, to come home to our communities, to come home, and to feel at home in the world, because so many people feel, and so many people in this room probably feel not quite at home in themselves, in their own bodies, in their own relationships, in their own spaces. So raise your glass. A toast!
A toast.
Thank you. To the thirst that won't be quenched. A toast.
A toast.
To the drought that dries up in the rain. A toast.
A toast.
To the drunk who finally stops drinking and drinks loneliness again. A toast
A
To
toast.
the fire that guts the past and clears way for future. A toast.
A toast.
To the country that misplaces its border guards. A toast.
A toast.
To the borderland between our lives and the dream of our lives. A toast.
A toast.
To the one who won the election for a country that no longer exists. A toast.
A toast.
To the president who dreams he's lost his arms and wakes with an itchy scalp. A toast.
A
To
toast.
the walls that grow doors overnight. A toast.
A
To
toast.
the migrants, the authors of movement who write with their feet. A toast.
A toast.
To beauty that has no reason but herself. A toast.
A
A toast to the youth who don't know history tells them it's not possible. A toast.
A
To
toast.
us in the middle of the thicket, and the only way forward is farther in. A toast.
A
To
toast.
the aged who lived their last years where they've always lived, in another country. A toast.
A
To the
toast.
dream of the other country that is and is not in this one. A toast.
A
To
toast.
social media and its endless feeds where the phone eats first. A toast.
A
A toast to the internet that helps us forget what we never knew we needed to know. A toast to
toast.
freedom where no one is free unless everyone is free. A toast
A
to the
toast.
last page of the internet which reads, "Go the fuck outside." A toast
A
to the
toast.
host and the guests, the ghost, and this house where we die together tonight and rise in some distant yesterday, our bodies hiding in the light of a forgotten open page. Thanks. I see you, Isaiah. Isaiah Hunt in the house, everybody.
Yeah.
George Bouguer, David Rosenthal, colleagues, dear colleagues, thank you for coming. Good Gideon. Not a colleague, Tom. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to explore in this book was really the story of how my family wound up in the United States. And one of the particularly traumatic incidents of exile that is part of our family story is my great-grandfather was exiled from Lebanon and found his way to Mexico. The story is partly in the book. But the traumatic incident that led us to come to the United States was that same great-grandfather, Iskandar Alexander, was murdered in Mexico. And I wanted to sort of trace that journey as best I could, and I had a real longing to see if I could find his grave in Salina Cruz. But in the process, I wanted to sort of walk with my ancestors in their journeys, kind of coming home. Because I think in so many ways our families have trauma in them that ghost us in all sorts of ways, and we sort of carry it, we internalize it. We don't even know it exists, and yet it's part of our very DNA. And so I think one of the reasons why I wanted to write about this and explore it was to kind of put it to rest, if I could, to try to rebury the ancestors that are unsettled by all the things that they had to face. So this is a poem in the voice of my grandfather, who was 15 years old when he witnessed his father get murdered. So they fled north. They found a way through. I think it was a long time ago at this point. And in this poem are a bunch of the stories that I know of this man who I never met, for whom there are no photographs, Iskandar, that he was apparently a very powerful man, that he could bend a penny or a dime between his thumb and his forefinger, and that he was elegant and graceful, and not that he was murdered, actually. Not that he was murdered, but that he was remembered. So this is the poem. The Arab crosses into Los Estados Unidos. Once I bathed in new phrases, spoke with the star throat, silked about in sentences, curled inside the parentheses of dream. Once my father bent a dime between his index and his thumb, snapped a house from air, swallowed gold fire captured in singing glass. Glass sang from his circling touch. But when they came for him, he danced to their orchestra of bullets. We did not wait to tuck him safely into earth, raise his name in stone. What we buried beneath our ribs. At the border of the country of the future, I own Nevers, dusty keys with no receiver. I carry him and cross the river. So during the pandemic, I was due to go to Mexico, and I wanted to track down the grave of this great-grandfather in Salina Cruz, but I could not. So I contacted a local woman to see if I could find it, and she looked around and she couldn't find a grave. And I was very sad, but in the process of writing this poem, I recognized that I don't need proof of his existence. I am here, I am proof of his existence, and I can do that work of burial in the poem. So that's what I tried to do. So if this poetry reading is not sad enough, now we're going to go a little sadder. The events since October 7th have been absolutely undoing for so many of us, creating a sense of loneliness, fear, anger, particularly for the Jewish community and for the Arab community. One of the things I tried to do here was to do a kind of a peace walk as a sort of way to grieve together, because I believe that we can only live together if we can also grieve together. I was given an assignment by a photographer to write about a certain word, a word from a language that's somewhat unknown, and this word was yazil, and yazil means to go on one's way. It's from Aramaic. And Aramaic is the root language from which Hebrew and Arabic spring. So I thought it was kind of interesting to be writing about the place where these two languages come from. And this is something we tried. I don't know how successful it was, but we did a peace walk. To go on one's way. Before the peace pole we gather, peace in a dozen tongues. A flutter of hands to wing this word we want to make in the absence of the world. Where I and you translates to we. Where we arise and go, walking the wide diameter of grief. Inside is an open field we see we cannot enter. Without words we walk, cradle shared sorrow. Are we always too late? The world is a narrow bridge, and the important thing as we walk the abyss that is in us, that is us, Rabbi Nachman says, the important thing is not to be paralyzed by fear. Clouds descended to earth, not fog this, but not rain either. A kind of impossible meeting, to arise and go on our way, to find one foot before the other. If pain cannot be housed, we must circle its circumference. Walking, it's said, is a series of controlled falls. We fall again and again. When Isaac Jogues failed to find his friend's grave, he declared the whole ravine a reliquary. Everywhere he stepped could be his friend's body. The whole earth is reliquary. Elsewhere, under the same sky, is crying metal, converting buildings to rubble. How to find the tongue beneath the tongue before it's split at the root. I walk inside the number 40, years and days, counting one by one. In those days he went out to the mountain to pray, the verse says, and all night he continued in prayer. Some forests are countries of fire. In the middle of the ocean or in the middle of an open-air seaside prison, some drink when thirst begins to burn the undrinkable sea. Some love what they cannot see is prison, one foot before the other. So many photographs, digital iconostases we hold in palms, victims of victims. Under the bombs we walk, under the bullets, under the rubble we walk, unable to reach the hurt place. Inside the technology of vengeance, of fear, whole family trees uprooted, no evaporated, prayed away all night even when it is day. We go on our way. Some images are paths, some are dead ends. We are cracked and crazed vessels. The Lord has poured so many tears in us, our faces can't hold them. The path is grief, the destination unknown. To say salam is to say shalom, is to wish wholeness upon another the world otherwise fails to offer. We offer up our emptiness surrounded by emptiness, our open palms lifted to emptiness. The Imam says, the everlasting peace is from you, God, and returns to you. One footstep for self, one for kind. The rabbi says, may it be your will, I lie down in peace and rise up in peace. One for self. Peace I leave with you, Jesus said. My peace I give to you. Like that we lean into future. Pray all day, even when it is night. God, what is this silence? There is no bottom. Arise and go, Micah says, for this is no place to rest, this present tense. God, what is this silence? God, the silence. We walk on our own path, beloved names still on our tongue, no place to put them. Our cracked lips part, filling with this sea, this ocean we open with our mouths. Thanks. And I realize we're sort of running out of time, but I wanted to read a poem with my daughter, Layla. You ready to do this? Okay. So this will be the second to last one, I guess. You can read on the same page. Yeah. So everybody, this is Layla.
Hi, Layla.
Aspiring writer. No, she's a writer. I'm an aspiring writer. So this is a poem that is a kind of parsing out of a very familiar Arabic phrase, which the Lebanese would say is ahla sahla, which means, or ahlan wa sahlan, which means welcome, but it literally kind of means, you know, you're like family to us, and this place is comfortable for you. So this poem is called, You Have Come Upon People Who Are Like Family in This Open Space. And it is an Arabic form poem, which means you read it from right to left, but we're going to do it together so you can hear kind of the both versions as we go. You have come upon people who are like family in this open space.
I cannot
No,
know
cannot I,
how this
end
will
with this
end,
how.
though
Both
we are both
low. Air
breathing
different
in
and
different
breathing.
air,
Flesh
planets of different
than
flesh. I won't stop.
I.
Holding my hand toward you. Ahlan wa sahlan. You have come upon people who
family
are
like
like
our
family. This
space
open
openness.
space. Openness
This
space.
open.
I
You welcome I that. Away
to turn
turn
away.
to.
Unless
Stay to
you
wish
wish
you
to
unless.
say, rest
Choose
and
your
remove
move
your
and
shoes.
rest.
We
Speak
lean
your
into your
interlean we.
Tender
Slave to
drink
drink
to
tender.
slake.
Eat
and
to
fullness
fullness
to
end. End
You
the
are the
you.
end
Beginning
of my
of mine.
beginning.
Of
The
beginning
beginning
be.
of my
and mine.
end.
Last poem, and I know there may be one or two people here who might be fasting or breaking fast. This is a poem inspired by a Muslim poem, which also sounds like some of the Psalms and also sounds like the St. Patrick's prayer. So we're all in conversation together. As I said earlier, Midrash is like fanfic, sacred text. Like this is my fanfic of sacred text. Devotional. And this is my wish to you to keep your light. Devotional. Light my face and light the flesh of my flesh. Light each my eyes and light inside my sight. Light the light that makes me light in the bones, and in my hands light, and in my loins light. And light your light before and behind me, above and beneath me. Light to my right and light to left. Light to my enemies who in the moral dark will use my light against me. Light the dull swords of my ribs, the thick fist within. Light the blood-hot rooms pulsing there. Light the gate when they swing wide to the stranger. Light, more light on my tongue. In the light, light, more light, in the black light. And when it's time to snuff this wick, light that light. Thank you. And now Dr. Topol is going to initiate a conversation and space for us to engage with you as well. Should I take this mic and bring it over?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks. Just pass it back.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
Well, I will just be initiating the conversation, but I think we might have some time to live, for the rest of the people. And I am a scholar of religious studies, so I'm particularly interested in how this speaks to religion. And it was easy for me to tie it in Jessica's book to religion because it is about speaking to scripture. It was a little bit more difficult with Phil's because he does not really openly talk about his faith, as much as Jessica does. But it's kind of part of what we say about religion. It's really something that you cannot really grab. Like you cannot say this is religion and this is not. Something that speaks to you, to your soul, might as well be coming from your religion. And I want to start with actually what this cover represents. The reason why you both chose seems to me like it talks about movement, going from somewhere to somewhere, but this is kind of in the middle. And I don't know if you can see the image, but people are throwing, like the keys are being thrown from the ship in the middle of the sea. Homelessness probably is the theme here. I think we come from religious traditions. I'm a Muslim and you're Jewish and you're Catholic, would you say?
Yes.
These are the traditions we come from. Teach us that we come from somewhere else. We belong to someplace else. And we ended up here for a reason, but we're not going to stay here. We're going to go back or go to somewhere else.
Are you saying we're aliens?
Maybe. So that's the question. How do you think that is seen in the search for belonging, for home, in your poems, like in your personal understanding, but also how we are kind of fascinated with these stories of exile and being directed by actually also an outside voice that we call God. So how would you speak to that? Like, is there something at our core that tells us from this religious point of view that we are strangers to this world and we are in a search for home?
Either way. Do you want to
Have a
start?
microphone.
That's because I'm holding it. So I think I was drawn to this cover because the boat is tilted upward in a precarious angle, and it seems to represent, as you say, the experience of migrants. There are so many of those, and there's a couple poems in here dedicated to people who were drowned in the Mediterranean as they fled their homelands. So this predicament of the exile is one that's where precariousness is a defining feature. And the keys also descending from this red thread. It looks like almost like a heart or something. Those keys are a little bit hard to see at first, but to me, keys are also an image of longing for home. In fact, for those who know the Palestinian story, the key is actually a key symbol for the longing for refugees to return. But all of us who know a place and feel and haven't been homed or have been unhoused feel that sense of a longing for a space that we could call safe. That's what drew me to it. And I think that one of the things I recognized in the process of writing this was that I realized that part of my interest in these people's lives and stories is not only a compassion for those who don't have those spaces, but also because that was the story, a traumatic story of our family's own journey. And recognizing that, and coming to terms with that, is part of the journey of writing this book.
I think Definitely the idea of diaspora, of exile, was part of what drew me to this image. Of course, I also thought of Noah's Ark. But the artist, Shota, talks about, the installation is called Key in Hand, the Key in Hand. And that each of the keys represents someone's memory. And I also love, there's a rabbinic teaching that every verse of Torah is a key, and that we spend our whole lives studying, finding which key fits which door. So I felt like that was all, there was some resonance there. But it's interesting to me that you say that it can amplify our sense of being strangers. Because for me, this experience was very much an experience of realizing that we're all connected. And that's, part of it is like being connected in deep time to our ancestors, seeing all the echoes between the past and the present. And I think that's been one of the most beautiful things about being in conversation with Phil, is that even, beyond just the covers, there's so many ways that our poems are in conversation with each other. And so the fact that I was terrified of how he would respond when our covers are the same, and that you responded with laughter, to me was just this further affirmation of connection. So.
And I also realized something in maybe a difference between the secular and the religious. Your poems are speaking to the divine speech, you're speaking to the Torah. And your poems are speaking mostly to daily news that we kind of see, maybe even court cases. Like there are many stories that are turned into like archives and official documents that we rarely look at as poetic. And so, like, does that make a difference in speaking to the divine speech through poetry? Or kind of how does that work here? How can you make something poetic? If it is the ultimate speech, if you consider the Torah being the divine speech, or if it is just the mundane speech, how does poetry transform that?
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
It's funny because I think reading your poems for me, I feel like they're deeply infused with the sacred, and that's part of, there's so many persona poems, and I feel like that kind of empathy to me feels very much like a sacred act. But I think that question about divine speech, so in Hebrew the word davar means a lot of things, but it means word and thing. So there's this idea that God speaks the world into being. But that's something we can't do. As people, we shape our art from the world around us. We cannot create something from nothing. And so I think that's what I was really interested in doing in these poems, is engaging with explicitly sacred text, but then infusing it with contemporary life. So there's garbage trucks, and I grew up in Florida, so there's a lot of alligators, there's gay beaches in Provincetown, so that felt like it needed to say, like, these stories matter to us.
I sort of think about Ignatius's idea that God, that the concept of God in all things, this idea that creation radiates, or as Gerard Manley Hopkins would say, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. Like on the one hand, wow, it sounds so ecstatic and mystical, but it's, that's, you have this interesting moment in that poem where there's like the longing for first sight of love, but also the desire to anchor or bed yourself in the familiarity of longer love. And I think that great poems move us between the sacred and the profane. They show the profane has splinters or sparks of the divine. They show that the divine is also problematic in other ways, and so they try to reawaken us to both the sense of divinity in all small things, and also a sense of perhaps that divinity is not simply an apathetic, unknowable being, but also something that's deeply close. I mean, one of the weirdest, most beautiful things about Scripture is that God is figured as a parent, a loving parent, and sometimes an angry parent, and sometimes a merciful parent, and sometimes a confusing parent. But that's our most primal relationships we have in life, is those who've cared for us. So anyway, some thoughts, I guess.
How much time do we have?
It's a little important, so I'll speak.
Okay, so I think you can
Open it up?
open it up
Yeah, sure.
to
Maybe
your
just a couple
comments.
questions? Yeah, sure.
If you have anything to ask or add about the poems that you've heard, or the motivations, I mean, the ideas behind the poetry,
Do a shot.
anything that seems striking to you? Yeah.
Love your work, by the way. Just got baptized last weekend, so I
Oh.
definitely understand like the call back to divinity. How did you go about writing? Did you read passages with a reflection, or was it line by line? How did you have this dialogue to write poetry?
She asked, oh, thank you. She asked about the process of writing. Did I go line by line? Like, how did that happen? So for me, I did a 7-year deep dive into scripture and into scholarship, midrash, rabbinic commentary, all of that. And then what I would do is, as I was taking notes, I would try to pay really close attention to what was happening in my body, so like how I felt, but then also what memories I was having when I was arguing with the text, which I did a lot. A confusing parent, as well said. So I would argue, I would have memories, I would have all these ideas, and then that marginalia would become the raw material for poems, but it would be bound with ideas and quotes from the text. Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about your process.
I don't know. I think Jessica and I share something, which is that we're both inveterate researchers. We are so curious about the world, and so we often dive into something, and then we get really thick, neck deep into it, and then we realize we need to figure out why we're so interested in this thing, because maybe not everybody is interested in this thing.
Yeah.
So the poems, I think, at least in terms of our shared process, have this moment of trying to come home to how the sacred or the story of the text sits in us, and what this reveals to us about ourselves and our relationship to the world around us. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? So, yeah, sure, yeah. And beginning with curiosity to me is the most important thing. And I know some of my students are still in the room. I hope if there's one thing I teach you, just be endlessly curious.
Yeah.
Always ask, questions about why things are, and the world will always be interesting.
And your writing will be way more interesting.
Do we have any other?
Can I ask you a question? Unless there is another, I don't want to steal. Oh, there is a
I
question.
have one question.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on your thoughts. Do I need that? Oh, okay. So I'm just curious on your thoughts. You all were talking. I'm not sure if it was Jessica or Phil, but you mentioned the idea of using writing as a way to connect back with your ancestors and with your heritage. And I'm curious just on your thoughts on the idea of how creative writing can be a way of connecting back to your heritage, where you're from and such, and how you're able to do that within your work or the process of that and such.
Yeah, I mean, I have some poems in here that really explicitly do that. So there's the story of Sarah, who is postmenopausal, realizing, being told that she's going to have a baby, and she laughs and then denies it, even though she kind of just laughs in her entrails is the exact translation. And she was, I think, 90 when she found out. And so I got to make a comparison between Sarah and my grandmother, who's about to turn 99, and laughs hysterically all the time. And it was this beautiful way to think about what our lineage is. and just finding all of those different ways of having connection and seeing figures from the past that still live today. And as a way of kind of, yeah, of having that connection, of showing that these stories still have relevance to us. Yeah.
I think I've become more and more attached to this idea that the writing is an attempt to have conversations with those who come before us, who are sometimes, not sometimes, who are genetically in advance of us, like in us, but also, the world of other writers and other people who've inspired us, and whether they're biblical figures or artists or people who are courageous in ways that we don't feel courageous. I suppose one of the reasons why I write is that it helps me feel connected not only to myself, but to the part of me that is not me, that is also in me, that I don't know if we call that God, or call that ancestor, or call that spirit, or call that, the life itself, the earth from which we come, So, I don't know, I know you, as a fellow writer, you probably feel that great sense of groundedness when you're in the flow of writing. When the writing is writing you as much as you're doing the writing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
When writing is your profession, that something that you're trained to do, how do you know, or what do you do when, I guess, is there anything that you keep for yourself when you're writing and digging into a topic, or how do you differentiate between what is published and what is used?
Oh, I see what's happening. To me, I think of that as the difference between personal and private. And so personal, a lot of these poems are deeply personal, but I feel comfortable sharing them. Private are things that are just for me, but the more that I've written and the older that I've gotten, I realize that the biggest factor distinguishing between those two things is just time. So oftentimes things that feel so intensely private or shameful, or like I couldn't possibly share it, I just need to let enough time go by where, one, I can make sure I'm being super honest. So like Phil talks about like connecting with that part of you that like is you and is not you. So to me, it's like, have I ruthlessly interrogated not just other people, but have I looked closely enough at myself? And can I make it into art? And that's usually kind of the deciding factor. I don't want to just be pointing fingers at anyone else.
Congratulations, by the way.
Appreciate it.
Sean is running for, what's this, what are you running for?
As an independent for U.S. House of Representatives.
Oh, congratulations.
John Carroll grad right there. Well, that's Sean Freeman, everybody. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I wanted just to say something real quick, and I don't remember what it was now. The difference between private and personal. Yeah, this is what it is. There is a whole realm of stuff that's deeply, that makes us vulnerable, and I think that those are also places of strength. But we need to have a relationship to that material that feels not exploitative to ourselves or to others. And in the process of this exploration, that which is in me. This is the thing, like I always tell to my students, like, all right, imagine like the hardest things, the most sad moments of your life, the most horrible things. Like, everybody has gone through all that before. And when you're at that age, you don't necessarily know it, but it is absolutely the case. All the feelings have been felt. You are not alone. And so I think that when I know that the thing I'm sharing is resonant of what it means to be human and not simply a kind of either laceration or expose, then I know that maybe it's worth sharing, that it can offer a space where others can say, I'm not alone.
And just to add to that, I'll just say that in my previous 2 books, the poems that were most frightening for me to not only write but to share were the poems that people most responded to. I think for exactly the reason you said.
I mean, it's like country music, blues music, metal music, punk music. It's all based on that. Where's our pain, like, and you know, and how do you share that and suddenly become joyful in community?
Yeah.
The fact that we have endured these things, you know. Almost anybody else?
I actually have maybe a connecting question, might be the final point. The concept of wrestling, God wrestling is something you covered, but the very sport of wrestling is very intimate actually. Yeah. It's not like other fighting, methods where you are always in defense and trying to hit. It's very intimate. You're touching your opponent very intimately. And in wrestling with God, wrestling with life, wrestling with systems of oppression, wrestling with ourselves, how would you kind of interpret that? Why do we call it wrestling? Is there something like you're putting yourself out there, like the whole privacy and personal, is I think part of that too. Without intimacy, this would not be a wrestling. What does God wrestling mean to you in that sense? I want you to imagine 2 people wrestling and how close that gets.
Yeah, and in a poem that I cut, it's also kind of the imagined wrestling with the self, right? Like that it's, to me, the idea of God wrestling, I think before when I just kind of like held religion out here and just, didn't look at it, there was no intimacy. But that also meant it couldn't harm me, because I think a lot of times, like I teach a lot of religious writing, people come to me and they have been wounded deeply by religion. And so like holding it out here meant it couldn't harm me, but it also couldn't touch me and it couldn't change me in any way. So to me, the idea of like actually using that verb of wrestling is exactly what you're talking about. It's drawing something close enough that you are fighting with it, but in a way that's like a dance or an embrace of some kind, and you're inviting it into your life. And I feel like that relationship, if you truly ask hard questions and let it ask hard questions of you, is going to be a relationship for the rest of your life. Because it can't be broken. There's always reciprocity in that.
Wrestling. I would say that I, like any person who doesn't like to follow orders, has fought with all sorts of church teaching that I felt was unjust, wrong, oppressive, patriarchal, anti-gay. So I think that religions often are formations, and institutional churches, as hierarchical as the Catholic Church is, requires us to be in conversation with it and to wrestle with it, and to not accept things that defy our sense of what is right, true, just, and good, and loving. And so that really messes up your relationship with the idea of the divine. Like, if these churches are supposed to be the conduits, the tunnels, these religious traditions, if they are problematic to us, then it blocks us from this opportunity for a sense of true connection to know that each of us in this room is part of the same being. That's like that mystical vision that every religion has, and yet which so many of the religions don't want to advertise, because then what will happen? So to wrestle is to be human, and it's to be in relationship, and it is to long for something, that you can accept and be blessed by, as that story is about.
Yeah.
probably good.
Yeah.
It's like, does it feel like 9,000 degrees in here? I'm just smoking hot up here. I wanted to thank also Suzanne Degatano, who's from MaxBacks here, who's selling books in the back. If anybody's interested in purchasing a book, having them signed. Please thank Jessica for joining us. For putting this through her fast. Did you get some with you?
No.
No, okay. I could, if I didn't eat all day, I would literally be on the ground. So, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. I see you.